When we arrived, my mother called me the family stain. My father looked at my son and said, "Get that bastard out of here." And then it started with a calendar alert I didn't remember setting and ended with my daughter crying in a hallway lined with fake marble. That's how I'll remember my brother's wedding. The night my family stopped pretending I mattered and showed their teeth like I was prey that wandered into the wrong forest. The reminder popped up as I was trying to wrangle dress shoes onto my son, who hated them so much he kicked them off 3 times before I gave him the look. He's 6 and fidgety, and even though I knew I shouldn't be going, I promised him cake. And I promised my daughter dancing, and I wasn't going to be the one to break it. The calendar notification said 5:45 p.m., black tie, dinner to follow. It should have felt normal. But that notification came from my own app. Not one single family member sent me anything. I hadn't been in the group chat for weeks, and I hadn't even noticed. I scrolled back and saw I was removed without warning, no message, no call, just gone. If not for my cousin Ray, who DM'd me on Instagram like I already knew, I wouldn't have even had the address. We got dressed in what we had, my best navy blazer, khakis without a stain in sight, the only collared shirt I bothered to iron this year. My daughter wore her sparkly shoes, and I didn't fight her on it. It wasn't worth the tears, and she looked happy. We pulled up to the venue, a reception hall near the old train station downtown that tried really hard to look expensive but still smelled like disinfectant and dust. The parking lot was stuffed full of luxury sedans and rented limos. Everyone outside looked like they walked out of a fashion catalog. When we walked up, heads turned. No smiles. Just a few sharp glances and a wave of disbelief that I was there. One aunt, Lorraine, I think, greeted me with a smirk and a tight, surprised "Oh, you came." No hug, no warmth. Just that thin smile that people give when they don't want to be rude in public. Inside, I grabbed a couple of programs and found a spot near the back with the kids. No one offered us a seat or said a word. I slid past us like we weren't even breathing. When Silas and Delilah walked down the aisle, hand in hand, my kids clapped because they thought they were supposed to. And I let them. They still believed in happy endings. I just stood still, my jaw clenched, pretending the air around me didn't burn. As the ceremony ended and people began moving to the next room, I walked over to the seating chart by the wall. My name wasn't there. Neither was my daughter's or my son's. I thought maybe I missed something, so I checked again. A server walked by and I asked quietly if he could help, and he just shrugged and said maybe I should check with the family. My mother floated up like a queen arriving to scold the help. She wore a purple gown that looked like it cost more than my rent and carried herself like she had earned something. She didn't greet me, didn't ask about the kids, just looked me dead in the face and said loud enough for people to turn their heads, "Why are you even here? We told you before, you're the stain this family doesn't talk about." People around her laughed. Someone behind me snorted, and I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I didn't say anything. I told myself to breathe, to keep my voice even. I said, "We're here for Silas." And she just shook her head like I disgusted her and walked away. Then Leonard, my father, came next. He didn't look at me, just pointed at my son and said, "Get that bastard out of here." No context, no hesitation, just poison in a single breath. I turned, not knowing what to do, and my daughter's hand was like ice in mine. She looked up and asked if we'd done something wrong, and I got down on her level and said, "No, baby, we're just going to get dinner somewhere else." Then Silas stepped in, grinning like the joke finally paid off. "You really came dressed like that? This is a wedding, not a shelter." His words cut clean, no hesitation. I looked behind him and saw the people who used to share Christmas tables with me, laughing at his words like they were some kind of performance. Then, from behind, something small and white landed at my feet. A napkin. Folded. And someone said, loud enough for the room to hear, "Wipe your tears and go." That was the moment it stopped being about me. I picked up the napkin, handed it to my son like it was nothing, and told the kids loud enough for every last person to hear, "Let's go." We don't beg for seats at tables that spit on us. Nobody stopped us. Nobody reached out. A few people looked away, but most watched like it was the best drama they'd seen all year. I could feel their eyes on us all the way to the exit, like we were something to be pitted, or worse, mocked. One groomsman stepped halfway in our path and opened his mouth like he had something clever to say, but I moved past him. My shoulder bumped his and he muttered something I didn't catch, but I didn't stop. I didn't flinch. I just kept walking, holding my daughter's hand, her sparkly shoes clicking like a metronome counting the end of something. Back in the car, I sat with my hands on the wheel, staring at the dashboard like it owed me answers. My daughter was quiet, just wiping her face with the program she never got to use. My son asked if we were going home. I said, yeah, and we're getting burgers. Extra fries. Just us. I pulled out of the lot, didn't look back. But the words they said, the looks, the laughter, every piece followed me home. I played it all again in my head until my stomach turned. I should have seen it coming. My family never wanted me there. Not when I chose divorce. Not when I refused to take their money and their rules. They always had room for Silas no matter how bad he screwed up. He could have burned a house down and they'd buy him a better one. But me, I raised my kids on my own, worked 3 jobs at one point, and I'm the stain? I didn't cry. I didn't break. I gave the kids ice cream for dinner and let them fall asleep watching cartoons. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up old files. Insurance policies, car loans, joint accounts, business paperwork I never asked to be part of but signed because they needed someone reliable. I made a list, not of things I wanted to say, but of things I could do, of every string I still held that they forgot I could pull. I didn't need revenge. I just needed them to know what it feels like when you bite the hand that holds the house key. The wedding was over, but what came next would be the part they never saw coming. The morning after the wedding, I stood at the kitchen counter stirring instant coffee that tasted like regret while the kids ate cereal on the couch, too young to realize the gravity of what had happened. My phone buzzed nonstop, notifications from people who weren't sorry, just loud. Texts from my mother saying, "Hope you got home okay," like I hadn't been thrown out of the family like trash from a moving car. Not one apology, not one admission. Just more photos, more fake smiles on social media, more pretend like nothing happened. And I stood there realizing something I should have seen years ago. They never thought I'd do anything back. But I wasn't the same man they pushed around when I was 23 and desperate for approval. I'd spent a decade cleaning up their messes, covering loans, signing things I never benefited from, just to be called a mistake in front of my kids. So I opened my notes app and started listing everything that still had my name on it. And by the time I reached the bottom of the list, I had a plan. I didn't yell. I didn't call. I didn't write one of those dramatic family emails people like to screenshot and laugh at. I just acted. First, the SUV. 5 years ago, Leonard needed a new vehicle and his credit was barely above a payday loans. He pulled me aside, told me it would mean a lot if I could be a man and help out just this once. I let them put it in my name. The payments were supposed to be automatic. Of course, they weren't. I paid 3 of them myself back when I still believed peace was something you could buy. So I called the insurance company first, told them to cancel the policy, told the lender to send all documents to their address, not mine. When they asked why, I told them I had no faith in the borrower. The guy paused like he'd never heard someone say it so directly. Then just said okay. Then the account. Back when I was barely scraping by, my dad convinced me to open a joint account for family emergencies, whatever that meant. He said it would be there in case someone needed help fast. In reality, it was a slush fund he could dip into without Ruth seeing the charges on their shared card. I hadn't checked it in over a year. When I logged in, it took all of 20 seconds to feel sick. Thousands gone. Not slowly, not responsibly, but in massive withdrawals. $2,000 here, $1,300 there. Half to Silas's debit card. Not once did they tell me. I flagged the withdrawals, shut the account, and called the bank to block any new attempts with my name. After that, I sent an email to the business partner my father bragged about for months. The one they brought me into on paper just for the credit approval, not the profit. I told him I was revoking my participation immediately and wanted my name removed from any binding documents. I copied my dad. His response came within an hour. His voice shook when he called, trying to sound composed, but every word cracked like a floor under weight it couldn't bear. He started with guilt. You're tearing this family apart. Then moved to gaslight. You don't even understand what you're doing. Then settled into fury. You'll regret this. I told him calmly that I was just protecting myself the way he always told me to. He hung up after calling me ungrateful. The final blow was Silas's car. That one hit different. He'd begged me to co-sign 2 years ago, said it would help him get on his feet. I said yes because at the time, I still thought maybe I could earn my way back into the family. I called the lender and said I was pulling out as a co-signer, citing financial irresponsibility and lack of trust. The rep told me it would trigger a review and potentially repossession. I said that was fine. All of this happened in the space of a single morning. By noon, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from release. Like my body realized I was finally letting go. I tried to play a game with my son to distract myself, but the phone wouldn't stop buzzing. First came Ruth. She didn't ask if I was okay. She asked if I had touched the insurance, because the SUV was missing. Apparently, they went to the church the next day to help with cleanup and found it towed. She cried on the phone and said I ruined their weekend. I told her I was done being their doormat. She hung up. Then Leonard called. His voice was louder than the first time I got a B on a test in middle school. He accused me of sabotaging the family, said I humiliated them, demanded I pay the impound fee and clean up the mess I made. I told him if he came near my apartment, I'd call the landlord and have him trespassed. He called me a coward before I placed the phone on the table and let him scream into empty air. 3 days later, I got the confirmation that the business deal had collapsed. The partner emailed saying without my signature, they had no funding and he was stepping back. I got a string of texts from Leonard in full meltdown mode. One calling me selfish, another saying I was proving I never loved them. I blocked him. Then I saw the lender had finalized the review on Silas's car and required new paperwork. Without it, the vehicle would be repossessed. I didn't tell Silas. I let the bank do its job. People started asking if I felt guilty. Cousins who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly remembered my number. Beverly sent me a long message saying I should find forgiveness and be the bigger person. I left her on read. Not once did she ask how my kids felt when they were humiliated in public. Not once did she say she was sorry for laughing. Every move I made was quiet, controlled. No yelling, no fights. I didn't post it on Facebook or send threats. I just acted like a man who knew where the wires were buried. They thought they could cut me out of their lives and still expect me to power their world. That I would keep funding their lies because I craved proximity. They never saw what happened when I stopped playing nice. I wasn't angry anymore, just done. And being done was the most dangerous version of me they'd ever meet. 2 days after I pulled the plug on everything, the calls started multiplying like flies around a fresh wound, but I didn't answer a single one of them. My voicemail was flooded with messages from people who hadn't said a word to me in years but suddenly thought they had the right to demand peace from the very person they'd all watched be torn down in silence. Aunt Beverly left 3 messages in a row, each more dramatic than the last, saying things like, "You're breaking your mother's heart," and "You've gone too far." That last part almost made me laugh. Too far? They threw me out like trash in front of my kids and called it tradition. Now that the balance of power shifted, they didn't know how to function without me cushioning the blow. That morning, I was flipping pancakes for the kids when there was a loud, violent pounding at the front door. Not a knock. Not even close. It was the kind of banging you hear in movies right before someone kicks in the door. I told my daughter to stay put, peeked through the peephole, and there he was, Silas, my golden brother, breathing hard like he'd run up the building in a rage. I didn't open the door all the way, just cracked it, just enough so he could see my face. And then he started yelling. No greeting, no shame, just pure rage wrapped in entitlement. "You're ruining everything," he screamed, spit flying. "You did this to wreck my life. You never wanted me happy." He shoved against the door like he wanted to push it open, but I stepped forward, my body blocking his path. I'm not a big guy, never have been, but I've spent enough time on my feet to know how to hold ground. I didn't yell. I didn't flinch. I just stared at him while he shouted. He tried again to force the door wider, but I pushed back and slammed it shut in his face. He cursed loud enough for my daughter to hear, and I heard her call from the kitchen, "Daddy, is everything okay?" I said yes, even though my hands were clenched into fists behind the door. Outside, I heard Silas stomp off down the hallway, still yelling, still trying to turn his tantrum into proof I'd wronged him. The text from Leonard came next. Furious, long messages written in all caps. shifting from guilt to threats every few lines. One second he was calling me his son, the next he was telling me I was dead to him. I blocked him without reading the rest. Then he started calling from other numbers. The desperation was dripping through every voicemail, but never once did he say he was sorry. They weren't seeking peace. They were scrambling for control. Meanwhile, Ruth found the number from my daughter's elementary school and called their front office pretending to be her grandmother looking for my updated address. The school secretary, bless her, called me directly and asked if it was legitimate. I told her no, not even close. I don't know how Ruth thought that would go. That I'd just show up at the door, tail between my legs, after what they did. They truly thought I had nothing without them. But what they never considered is that I had peace now. I had space. I had my children, who looked at me every day like I was enough. Extended family started getting involved like I was holding the last lifeboat and refusing to lower it. Uncle Thomas left a voicemail telling me to remember where you came from and that family comes before ego. I remembered just fine. I remembered when they laughed as I was pushed out the door, remembered when they turned their backs on a child crying. Family was supposed to protect you, not punish you for growing beyond their grip. Then the real collapse began. Silas's car got repossessed in broad daylight outside his apartment. He didn't even see it coming. I know this because he called from a friend's phone 5 hours later, voice vibrating with fury and panic, saying I'd ruined his credit and left him stranded like a criminal. He said his boss was threatening to fire him and that he might lose his job. I told him calmly, actions have consequences. Then hung up. 10 minutes later, he sent a storm of texts, all caps, filled with blame, threats, and insults. I didn't reply. They've been running their mouths for years. Now they could talk to the silence. By the end of the week, I got word from Ray, my only cousin who'd ever really seen what they were. She said Ruth and Leonard were calling around trying to borrow money, that Silas was couch hopping with friends who were already getting tired of him. Their financial safety nets had holes in them they couldn't patch because they never learned how to live without leaning on someone else. Ruth's credit took a nosedive, Leonard's business loan defaulted, and the vendor he bragged about partnering with pulled out entirely once I revoked my support. They kept trying to rally support from relatives, calling it a family betrayal, painting me as a monster. But no one really stepped up to help. They all remembered the years of smug dinners, the dismissive comments, the way Leonard and Ruth acted like royalty at every holiday while everyone else picked up the slack. Now those same relatives watched them squirm and said nothing. The circle closed, but not around me. Then came the day Ruth showed up at my door. She looked wrecked, face blotchy, makeup smeared, hair pulled back like she hadn't slept. She started off crying, begging, saying things like, "How could you do this to your own mother?" I didn't answer at first. I just stood in the doorway, watching her fall apart. Then, when she reached forward like she was going to touch me, I stepped back. She slapped me. Not hard, more desperate than violent, but enough. I caught her wrist, held it just long enough to say, "Don't ever raise your hand to me again." She staggered back, sobbing now, saying I was cruel, that I was killing her. I didn't say anything else. Just closed the door and let her sob on the other side. I watched through the peephole as she slid down to the ground, holding her face like she'd been hit. She hadn't. She just couldn't believe the game had changed and I wasn't playing anymore. That night, my daughter asked why Grandma was crying outside. I said sometimes people cry when they can't control someone anymore. She thought about that, nodded, and went back to her drawing. My son asked if we could have pizza. I said of course. We ate dinner on the floor, watched cartoons, and laughed like we had the whole world to ourselves. Because in that moment, we kind of did. I thought the worst had already passed, that I'd done what I needed to do, and now the noise would die down. But I should have known better than to expect quiet from a family that only operates in chaos. The first clue came early on a Saturday morning when I stepped outside to take the trash out and saw Leonard's car parked crooked at the end of the lot, engine still running, windows fogged like he'd been sitting there for a while, maybe debating whether to get out or drive off again. I didn't stop, just tossed the trash and went back inside, locking the door with the kind of calm that only comes after you've been exhausted into clarity. My phone started vibrating minutes later, nonstop. No caller ID, then Delilah, then Silas, then Ruth, all one after another like they were taking shifts at a call center for narcissists. I silenced the ringer and set the phone face down on the counter, poured cereal for the kids like nothing outside that window mattered, because it didn't, not anymore. But the knocking started not long after. First soft, like they were trying to play reasonable. Then louder. Then it turned into pounding again. So heavy the neighbor downstairs shouted from his porch to keep it down or he'd call the cops. I opened one slat in the blinds and looked down just in time to see Leonard throwing a plastic lawn chair into the middle of the street, shouting something I couldn't hear. Ruth was sitting on the grass, crying, dress soaked from morning dew and smeared with whatever was left of her dignity. Silas stood next to the car like a statue, arms crossed, eyes on the pavement like if he didn't make eye contact, he could pretend this wasn't real. They'd come to make a scene, and they were succeeding, but not in the way they thought. Neighbors peeked through their curtains. A few came outside. One even started filming. I didn't care. Let the world see what they looked like when the mask came off. Eventually, Silas made his way to the door. He didn't knock, just leaned into the wood like he could talk through it, and whispered, "Please, just talk to us. We need you to fix it." I opened the door a crack and stared at him through the gap. He looked like hell, shirt wrinkled, eyes bloodshot, hair unwashed. "You have to fix this," he said again, more urgent now, desperation cracking through his voice like ice under a heavy step. "You did this. You have to make it right." I didn't say anything at first, just held his gaze until he tried to push the door open like before, and again, I slammed it back in his face. He shouted that I was destroying everything, that I didn't get it, that I was ruining people who loved me. I said, loud enough for him and everyone on the grass to hear, "Now you know how it feels." Then I locked the deadbolt and walked away from the door for good. Outside, Ruth collapsed fully into the lawn like a discarded prop from some melodramatic stage play. Leonard kept shouting, sweating through his shirt, waving his arms like he was directing traffic in hell. Delilah showed up a few minutes later, stepped out of a rideshare looking like she hadn't realized this wasn't going to be a quick fix. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just stood there watching her new husband crumble in real time. Silas yelled something at her, and she turned away, pulling out her phone, probably to text someone who hadn't wrecked her social credit score. The hours dragged on. They wouldn't leave. At one point, Leonard sat down in the middle of the sidewalk like a child in timeout, muttering to himself. Ruth kept alternating between sobbing and shouting at no one in particular. I played a board game with the kids in the living room while the noise outside sounded like a thunderstorm made of broken pride and failed expectations. Eventually, the landlord showed up. I didn't call him this time. Someone else must have. He walked up with his hands in his pockets, calm and slow, looked at the scene, and told them to move the car or it was getting towed. Leonard tried to puff up, tried to get in his face, but the landlord didn't flinch. Just crossed his arms and said, "You've got 5 minutes." That was the moment it all cracked. Ruth started wailing like something sacred had died. Leonard yelled that he was calling a lawyer. Silas just stood there, jaw clenched, breathing like he was about to pass out. They didn't get 5 minutes. They got 3 before the landlord pulled out his phone, and that was enough to make them scramble. Leonard helped Ruth off the lawn. She didn't fight it, just slumped into the car. Silas drove. No one looked back. No one said goodbye. I watched it all through the window, arms crossed, face blank. The kids asked if they were coming back. I told them I didn't think so. My daughter asked if they were still family. I thought about it for a long second before I said, "Sometimes family is just a word people use when they want something." She nodded like that made perfect sense and went back to her puzzle. My son asked if we could have ice cream. I said sure. Extra sprinkles. Why not? That night, I turned my phone back on. There were voicemails stacked like bricks in a wall, dozens of them. Some begging, some threatening, all exhausting. Leonard's voice went from pleading to accusing, from "we need you" to "you're a monster" in the span of a few messages. Ruth said she was heartbroken, that I was killing the family, that I'd always been cruel. Silas's messages were mostly incoherent rage, shouting about being ruined, about jobs lost and opportunities gone. Delilah didn't call. That told me enough. I didn't answer any of them. I didn't text back. I didn't unblock a single number. I made dinner, tucked the kids into bed, and watched the quiet settle like snowfall across the space where noise used to live. For the first time in a long time, The silence felt like peace instead of punishment. I didn't feel bad. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt done. And that was enough. I thought the worst of it had passed, that after the parking lot circus and the voicemails that swung from weeping to screaming in under 30 seconds, they'd finally get the message and disappear like all toxic things do when they realize they can't feed anymore. But that's not how people like them operate. They don't stop because they're sorry. They stop when there's nothing left to destroy, and even then, they linger like mold on walls that have forgotten sunlight. I stayed quiet. I didn't reply, didn't unblock, didn't explain anything to anyone. I owed them nothing, especially after what they did in front of my children, who, by the way, hadn't asked once about their grandparents since the door slammed shut. Then came the final move, the kind of desperate play someone only makes when they finally realize the leash is gone and the dog they used to beat learned how to bite back. The first sign came early one morning when I checked my phone and found over 50 missed calls, each from a different number, half of them unknown, some with area codes I hadn't seen since high school. I didn't answer a single one. I put the phone down and finished making breakfast while my daughter laughed at a cartoon and my son asked if dinosaurs ever ate pancakes. Then I noticed the car again, Leonard's beat-up sedan, crooked in the lot. Only this time with the windows rolled halfway down and the back seat filled with boxes. I didn't panic. I just closed the curtains, texted the landlord a heads up, and made sure the kids were settled with their books and cereal. The first knock wasn't even a knock. It was more like the sound of someone slapping the door with an open palm. Then it escalated. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I already knew who it was. Leonard shouting from outside like we were in some small-town courtroom, his voice cracking from too much yelling and not enough control. Ruth was sobbing again, louder this time, dramatic as ever, saying I'd ruined her life and broken her spirit, that I was heartless, ungrateful, that I owed them everything they'd stolen from me. I watched through the peephole as they completely unraveled, Leonard throwing objects from their trunk into the street. One of them a wedding photo album that burst open like a wounded bird, pictures scattering across the pavement while Ruth collapsed beside it like the scene deserved an audience. Silas showed up 10 minutes later, pacing like a man who knew his job was on the line and had nowhere left to sleep. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He just stared at my window like he could burn through it with resentment alone. Then he finally walked to the door and whispered through the wood, voice barely holding steady. "You win. We need you. Just pick up. Please." I didn't reply. I didn't move. I just listened as they broke down inch by inch, each louder than the last, each trying to make the moment about them when they had already made every past moment about themselves. Neighbors were recording now. One asked if I wanted her to call the police. I said no. Let them finish this act. Let the entire world see what they look like when they don't have a scapegoat to crucify. Then Ruth tried the handle, rattling it like maybe, just maybe, I hadn't locked it. When it didn't budge, she slumped to the floor, sobbing so hard it echoed through the vents. Leonard shouted something about curses and legacies, things he thought sounded important but just sounded pathetic. Silas sat on the curb, hands in his hair, muttering to himself like he'd just figured out that actions actually have consequences. That was when the landlord arrived. Calm as ever, keys jangling in his coat pocket, he stepped up and told them flatly they had 60 seconds to clear out before tow trucks and cops became involved. They didn't argue. They knew this was it. Ruth tried one last time, crying my name like a plea. I didn't answer. I sat on the living room floor with my daughter, helping her line up her colored pencils by shade, while my son practiced spelling dinosaur names in his sketchbook. Outside, the sound of the sedan door slamming shut was the last thing I heard before silence returned like an old friend. That night, I checked my messages for the final time. Voicemails full of empty apologies, recycled blame, promises to change, followed by threats that rang hollow because they knew I no longer feared them. They kept saying I was heartless, but they forgot what broke me wasn't a lack of love. It was the exhaustion of being hurt by people who insisted they loved me. They didn't want forgiveness. They wanted control again, and I wasn't giving it. The next week passed with no more door pounding, no more drive-bys. It was quiet. My kids were calm, sleeping better than they had in months, and I felt something inside me begin to reset. I started unpacking pieces of myself I hadn't touched in years. I applied for a remote job I actually wanted instead of one I needed. I started going on walks with the kids in the evenings, not looking over my shoulder, not checking my phone. We found a pizza place nearby that served slices as big as your head and gave kids extra cheese without charging for it. A month later, Ray messaged me, said the family was still reeling and hoped I might be open to a conversation. I told her gently that I wished her well, but I wasn't interested in being baited back into a pit I barely escaped. She didn't argue, just replied, "I get it. I really do." That was the only message from anyone that didn't sting. I haven't heard from them since. Maybe they're still talking about me at Sunday dinners, spinning stories about how I turned cold, how I burned the bridge. Let them. If it helps them sleep to call me a villain, I'll wear it like armor. Because in their story, I might be the storm, but in mine, I'm finally the silence after it.